Long before Game of Thrones made royal intrigue a TV phenomenon, a 1975 British series captivated audiences with real-life palace scandals, family dynasties playing musical chairs with the same role, and actors literally suffocating in corsets for authenticity. From a father and son both playing the same king in different productions, to sets being frantically redecorated between scenes, this groundbreaking period drama hid dozens of bizarre production secrets behind its lavish costumes. Here are the 15 weird facts you didn't know about Edward VII. Fact 1. 3 generations of one acting family played the same king. Here's something that sounds like it came straight out of a strange Hollywood legend, but it actually happened with a British television series. Timothy West starred as King Edward VII in this 1975 drama, playing the monarch from his 20s all the way through to his death at age 68. But here's where things get genuinely peculiar. Timothy's own father, an actor named Lockwood West, had already played the exact same historical figure just 3 years earlier in a 1972 episode of the popular series Upstairs, Downstairs. That episode was called Guest of Honor and featured Lockwood as the king during a royal visit to the Bellamy household. As if that wasn't strange enough, Lockwood would go on to play Edward VII yet again in 1981 for another series called The Life and Times of David Lloyd George, making him a sort of repeat royal impersonator across 3 different productions spanning nearly a decade. But the family connections don't stop there. Timothy West's real-life sons, Samuel and Joseph, were cast as the young princes George and Eddie in Edward VII, playing the on-screen children of the character their father portrayed. This created an almost surreal situation where 3 actual generations of the West family were all connected to portraying the same monarch and his immediate family across multiple television productions. Samuel West, who played young Prince George, would go on to become a highly respected actor himself, appearing in productions like All Creatures Great and Small decades later. The whole arrangement was completely unplanned as a dynasty, but it resulted in this bizarre piece of television history where a grandfather, father, and grandsons all ended up in the same royal orbit, making the Wests perhaps the only acting family to have such an oddly specific 3-generation connection to a single historical figure. Fact 2. The leading lady got top billing over the title character. In what might be the most ironic casting decision in television history, the series called Edward VII actually gave top billing to someone who wasn't Edward at all. Annette Crosby, who played Queen Victoria, received first billing in the opening credits despite the show literally being named after her son. This meant that every single episode opened with Crosby's name appearing before Timothy West, who actually played the title character. What makes this even more unusual is that Crosby only appeared in 10 out of the 13 total episodes, meaning she wasn't even present for nearly a quarter of the series, yet still maintained her top position in the credits. The producers made this decision very deliberately, and it turned out to be oddly fitting when you consider the real history involved. In actual life, Edward spent nearly 60 years waiting in his mother's shadow, constantly being pushed aside and given no real responsibilities or power, while Victoria ruled the British Empire for decades. He was essentially the longest-serving heir apparent in British history, stuck in a holding pattern while his mother refused to let him participate in any meaningful way in governing the country. The billing arrangement accidentally mirrored this historical dynamic perfectly, with Edward once again being overshadowed by his mother, even in a television series specifically about his life. Crosby's performance as Victoria was so commanding and critically acclaimed that it won her the 1976 BAFTA Television Award for Best Actress, which probably justified the top billing decision from the producer's perspective. Her portrayal became the definitive version of Queen Victoria for many viewers, and the series really did function as much as a story about Victoria's relationship with her son as it did about Edward himself. The arrangement was strange, certainly, but it ended up reflecting the actual power dynamic that defined Edward's entire existence until he finally became king at age 59. Fact 3. An actress had to wear 2 corsets simultaneously. The lengths that actors go to for historical accuracy can sometimes border on the absurd, and Helen Ryan's experience filming the wedding scene for Edward VII definitely falls into that category. Ryan, who played Princess Alexandra and later Queen Alexandra throughout most of the series, had to endure wearing not just one corset, but two separate corsets at the same time for the elaborate royal wedding sequence between her character and Prince Edward. This wasn't some kind of costume department mistake or confusion, but rather a very deliberate and calculated decision to achieve the exact look that the real Princess Alexandra would have had on her actual wedding day in 1863. The first corset was designed specifically to compress Ryan's waist down to match Alexandra's historically documented 22-inch waist measurement, which was considered the ideal feminine figure during the Victorian era. But that alone wasn't enough to create the dramatic silhouette that the costume designers were aiming for. The second corset was then layered on top of the first one, and its purpose was entirely different. This outer corset was structured to create an exaggerated hourglass figure, pushing and shaping Ryan's body into the extreme proportions that were fashionable among European royalty at the time. Ryan herself described the experience in interviews during production, explaining that one corset kept her waist compressed while the other gave her the required hourglass shape that would be visible in the heavy wedding gown. The double corset arrangement meant that Ryan was essentially being squeezed and shaped by two layers of restrictive undergarments simultaneously, which must have made the long filming hours for the wedding scenes particularly uncomfortable. This commitment to period authenticity extended throughout the entire production, with the costume department going to extraordinary lengths to replicate not just the visible clothing, but also the foundation garments that created the distinctive Victorian silhouette that modern audiences would recognize as authentic to the era. Fact 4. The series created its own successful spin-off. Sometimes a supporting character makes such a strong impression that they end up launching their own entire show, and that's exactly what happened with Francesca Annis and her portrayal of Lily Langtry in Edward VII. Annis appeared in only 2 episodes of the original 13-episode series, playing the famous Victorian actress and socialite who became one of Prince Edward's most well-known romantic interests during his decades as the Prince of Wales. Her screen time was relatively brief in the grand scheme of the series, but her performance left such a memorable impact on both audiences and the creative team that it sparked something much larger. David Butler, who had written the majority of Edward VII's episodes, was so impressed with what Annis brought to the character that he decided to create an entirely new series centered specifically around Lily Langtry's life. This wasn't just a quick cash grab spin-off, but rather a fully developed 13-episode series that aired in 1978, just 3 years after the original show concluded. The new series, simply titled Lily, was produced by London Weekend Television and allowed Annis to explore the character in much greater depth, covering Langtry's entire life from her teenage years on the island of Jersey through her career as an actress and her complex relationships with various members of British high society, including her affair with Prince Edward, which had been briefly touched upon in the original series. The spin-off proved to be a significant success in its own right, earning strong ratings and critical acclaim. Annis's expanded portrayal of Lily Langtry was so well received that she won the 1979 BAFTA Television Award for Best Actress for the role, cementing the spin-off's place as a legitimate standalone achievement rather than just a footnote to Edward VII. The series demonstrated how effectively 2 episodes could serve as a launching pad for an entire show when the right character and the right performance came together. Fact 5. John Gielgud played the same historical figure. Awesome to you are twice 34 years apart. It's extremely rare for an actor to portray the same historical figure in 2 completely different productions separated by several decades. But that's precisely what happened with the legendary Sir John Gielgud and his interpretation of British Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli. Gielgud first took on the role of Disraeli in a 1941 film appropriately titled The Prime Minister, which was produced by Warner Brothers' British subsidiary and covered the politician's life and career in considerable detail. The film showed Disraeli's journey from a young novelist trying to break into politics all the way through his time as Prime Minister and his complex relationship with Queen Victoria, who appears as a major character throughout the story. Then, 34 years later in 1975, Gielgud was cast once again as Benjamin Disraeli, this time for the television series Edward VII. At this point in his career, Gielgud was already considered one of Britain's greatest living actors, and his presence in the series brought tremendous prestige and gravitas to the production. His portrayal of Disraeli in the series focused particularly on the Prime Minister's relationship with both Queen Victoria and her son Prince Edward, showing the political maneuvering and personal dynamics that defined that era of British politics. The character appeared in multiple episodes throughout the series, giving Gielgud substantial material to work with and allowing him to bring decades of additional acting experience to a role he had already inhabited as a much younger man. What makes this casting particularly fascinating is that Gielgud was able to bring a completely different perspective to the same historical figure after living an entire additional chapter of his own life between the two performances. By 1975, he was in his 70s and had become one of the most respected theatrical actors in the world, which meant his second interpretation of Disraeli carried a weight and authority that his younger self simply couldn't have achieved back in 1941. Fact 6. Game of Thrones. Star Charles Dance made his TV debut. Here, decades before he would terrify audiences as the cold and calculating Tywin Lannister in Game of Thrones, Charles Dance was just starting out in his acting career and appeared in Edward VII in what was described as one of his earliest television roles. Dance was cast as Prince Eddie, who was the eldest son of Prince Edward and Princess Alexandra, and the character appeared in only 2 episodes of the series. The role required Dance to portray the tragic prince who died unexpectedly at the young age of 28, a historical event that dramatically changed the line of succession for the British throne, since Eddie had been the direct heir before his untimely death. At the time of filming in 1975, Dance had only recently been accepted as a company member with the Royal Shakespeare Company and was still building his reputation in British theatre. His appearance in this prestigious television production came right at the beginning of what would eventually become an extremely successful and long-lasting career in both film and television. The series was broadcast during the same year that Dance was performing in various Shakespeare productions, showing just how early in his professional journey this role came along. What makes Edward VII particularly interesting from a casting perspective is that Dance wasn't the only future star who appeared in the series during the early stages of their career. The production also featured Felicity Kendal, who would go on to become famous for her role in The Good Life, as well as several other actors who later found significant fame in various British television programs and films. This means that viewers going back to watch the series today can spot multiple familiar faces in roles they took on long before they became household names, turning the show into something of a time capsule of British acting talent from the mid-1970s. Fact 7. 120. Elaborate sets were built, some used for only minutes. The scale of production design for Edward VII was absolutely staggering when you consider that the design team created 120 completely different sets across the 13 episodes of the series. This meant an average of more than 9 unique sets per episode, each requiring careful construction, decoration, and dressing to match the historical period being portrayed. What makes this even more remarkable is that some of these elaborate sets, particularly the grand palace ballrooms and ornate staterooms, appeared on screen for only a few minutes of actual filming time before the production moved on to the next scene and never returned to that particular set again. The designers responsible for this enormous undertaking were Tony Waller and Henry Graveney, who faced the monumental task of creating convincing Victorian-era interiors that would need to span several decades of the 19th and early 20th centuries. Many of these sets had to give the illusion of being far larger than the actual studio space allowed, which required clever use of perspective and painted backdrops to make rooms appear more expansive and grand than they physically were. The challenge was particularly intense for the palace interiors, which needed to convey the immense scale and opulence of actual royal residences despite being constructed within the limitations of a television studio. Perhaps the most demanding aspect of the set design came during one specific episode that depicted the period immediately following Queen Victoria's death in 1901. The script called for several palace rooms to be shown before and after her passing, which meant the sets needed to be completely repainted and redressed within just a few hours to reflect the traditional redecorating that occurred after a monarch's death. The production crew had to work at remarkable speed to transform these elaborate sets without causing any delays to the filming schedule, repainting walls and replacing furnishings between scenes to show the visual change in the palace atmosphere. Fact 8. The royal family opened their archives for research. In what was considered an extremely rare and generous gesture at the time, Buckingham Palace granted the production team of Edward VII unprecedented access to the royal archives housed at Windsor Castle, something that simply wasn't commonly done for television productions in the 1970s. This level of cooperation from the royal family was particularly remarkable because it gave the designers and researchers the ability to examine materials and documents that were normally kept away from public view and were considered part of Britain's private royal heritage. The permission was secured by executive producer Cecil Clarke, who had approached the royal family directly to request assistance in making the series as historically accurate as possible. Once inside the archives, the production team was able to study an incredible collection of primary source materials that documented the actual lives of Queen Victoria, Prince Edward, and their extended family. These materials included numerous leather-bound volumes containing official records of royal functions, ceremonies, and state occasions that had been meticulously kept throughout Victoria's long reign. The archives also contained a substantial collection of watercolor paintings that had been commissioned during the Victorian era, which proved to be particularly valuable for the costume designers because they showed the exact colors, fabrics, and styling details of the clothing worn by various members of the royal family during specific events and time periods. The commitment to authenticity went even further when costume designer Anne Hollywood was granted permission to visit Kensington Palace, where some of Queen Victoria and Queen Alexandra's actual original dresses were still being preserved in storage. Hollywood was able to examine these garments up close, studying their construction, the specific materials used, and the fine details of their embroidery and embellishments. This hands-on research allowed the costume department to create exact replicas of historical garments, rather than merely approximating what they might have looked like based on paintings or photographs alone. Fact 9. Annette Crosbie couldn't fit through doorways or use the canteen. The authentic Victorian costumes that Annette Crosbie had to wear as Queen Victoria created some genuinely practical problems during the production of Edward VII, and these difficulties went far beyond just being uncomfortable or restrictive. The dresses were so enormously wide and voluminous with their multiple layers of fabric and the massive crinolines and petticoats required to create the proper silhouette that Crosbie literally could not fit through certain doorways or navigate around the furniture in the studio canteen, where the cast and crew would normally go to eat their meals during breaks. Crosbie herself spoke about this issue in interviews at the time, explaining that the furniture used in modern spaces simply wasn't designed to accommodate someone wearing the kind of dress that would brush past everything and knock things over. So she had to avoid the canteen entirely and take her meals elsewhere. But the challenges didn't stop with just the outer clothing. Crosbie also had to wear extensive padding underneath her costumes to approximate Queen Victoria's actual body shape, particularly her bust, measurement which had reached nearly 60 inches by the later years of her life. To put that in perspective, a 60-inch bust is extraordinarily large, and Crosbie, who was naturally a small woman, needed significant padding to even begin to approach that size. However, the producers and costume designers ultimately made the decision to use less padding than would have been truly historically accurate because they realized that showing Victoria's actual proportions would look too extreme and potentially distracting on television screens. Crosbie mentioned that she started each episode with a little bit of padding and gradually increased the amount as Victoria aged throughout the series, but even at the maximum amount, she still wasn't wearing enough padding to match Victoria's real measurements. The compromise allowed Crosbie to move somewhat more freely while still giving viewers the general impression of Victoria's distinctive physical appearance during her later years. Fact 10. The series had different titles in different countries. When the series crossed the Atlantic Ocean to be broadcast in the United States, it underwent a significant name change that reflected the different marketing strategies being used for British versus American audiences. In the United Kingdom, where it originally aired on ITV between April and July of 1975, the show was called Edward VII, using the formal style of numbering that British viewers would have been completely familiar with from their own history lessons and royal traditions. However, when the same series was prepared for American broadcast, the distributors decided to rename it Edward the King, presumably because they felt this simpler and more straightforward title would be more immediately accessible to viewers who might not be as familiar with British royal naming conventions, or who might find the use of ordinal numbers less appealing. The American version of the series also included another distinctive element that set it apart from the British broadcasts. Each episode featured specially filmed introductions by Robert McNeill, who was a Canadian-American journalist and broadcaster that American public television audiences would have recognized from his work on various news and documentary programs. McNeill's introductions served to provide context and background information for viewers who might not have been as well versed in British history or the specific events and personalities being depicted in each episode, essentially functioning as a brief educational primer before the main content began. This dual identity for the same series was part of a broader pattern in the 1970s where British television productions were often repackaged and retitled when they were sold to American networks, with the changes designed to make the content feel more approachable and less foreign to audiences on the other side of the Atlantic. The decision to use different titles also meant that some viewers today might not immediately realize they're talking about the same show when one person refers to Edward VII and another mentions Edward the King, despite both names referring to the identical 13-episode series. Fact 11. Timothy West needed 5 different wigs. Playing a character who ages from his early 20s all the way through to his death at age 68 presented some significant challenges for Timothy West, and the hair and makeup department had to come up with a carefully planned solution to show the gradual aging of Prince Edward and later King Edward over the course of nearly 5 decades. The production team created 5 completely different wigs for West to wear throughout the 13 episodes, with each wig designed to represent a different stage in Edward's life and showing the natural progression of his hair as he aged from a young prince into an elderly monarch. Each successive wig had to reflect not just the changing color of Edward's hair as it grayed over time, but also the different styling and grooming trends that were popular during various periods of the Victorian and Edwardian eras. West himself spoke about the experience of wearing these different wigs in interviews during production, mentioning that he initially felt quite daunted by the idea of portraying the character starting at age 22, which was considerably younger than West's actual age at the time of filming. He explained that it took him until around the end of episode 6, when the character had reached his mid to late 20s, before he really felt comfortable and confident in the role. The progression through the different wigs helped him physically embody the aging process and gave him external markers that corresponded to the character's emotional and psychological development across the decades. However, the production's commitment to authenticity went even further than just using wigs. For the final episodes depicting Edward as an elderly king in his 60s, the decision was made to actually cut West's own natural hair quite short and then bleach it gray rather than continuing to rely on wigs. This choice gave those later scenes a more realistic appearance and allowed West greater freedom of movement without worrying about a wig shifting or looking artificial on camera during the physically demanding filming schedule. Fact 12. The show filmed on the same sound stages as Oliver. Edward VII made use of Shepperton Film Studios for a significant portion of its interior filming, and these sound stages had a particularly distinguished history in British cinema because they were the same location where the Academy Award-winning musical Oliver had been filmed just a few years earlier in 1968. Oliver had won 6 Oscars, including Best Picture, and its elaborate Victorian-era sets had transformed Shepperton stages into a convincing recreation of 19th century London. So there was a certain appropriateness to using the same facility for another major production set during roughly the same historical period. The studio provided the controlled environment necessary for building the numerous elaborate interior sets that the series required, allowing the production team to construct everything from palace staterooms to more intimate private chambers without having to worry about weather conditions or natural lighting variables. However, the production didn't rely exclusively on studio work, and in fact secured some remarkably prestigious real-world filming locations that added genuine authenticity to certain scenes. Through careful negotiation and the cooperation they had already established with the royal family for access to the archives, the production team was granted permission to bring their cameras into the actual royal gardens at both Sandringham and Windsor Castle. This was an extraordinary privilege that allowed them to film outdoor sequences in the genuine locations where the historical events had actually taken place, giving those scenes a level of authenticity that would have been impossible to replicate on a soundstage or in any other substitute location. The combination of high-quality studio construction at Shepperton with selective use of authentic royal locations created a production approach that balanced practical filmmaking needs with the desire for historical accuracy. The studio work allowed for complete control over lighting, camera angles, and the ability to build sets that could be modified or struck as needed, while the real location filming at Sandringham and Windsor provided genuine period architecture and landscapes that grounded the series in actual royal settings. Fact 13. A historic nickname was considered perfectly appropriate in 1975. One of the most striking examples of how cultural attitudes and language sensitivity can shift dramatically over just a few decades involves a historically accurate nickname that appears repeatedly in the first episode of Edward VII. The young Princess Victoria, who was Queen Victoria's eldest daughter and commonly known as Princess Vicky, was frequently called by the affectionate family nickname Pussy throughout the early episodes of the series. This wasn't something the writers invented for dramatic purposes, but rather was the actual documented nickname that the royal family used for her during the 19th century, when the term was simply an innocent reference to cats and had no other connotations whatsoever in everyday British English. When Edward VII was broadcast in 1975, the producers and writers included this nickname without any hesitation or concern because it was both historically accurate and still relatively innocuous in the cultural context of that time period. The series aired on national television with multiple characters using this term of endearment for the young princess, and apparently no viewers complained or found it problematic because the vulgar slang meaning of the word hadn't yet become the dominant association in most people's minds. Historical children's rhymes like "Pussycat, Pussycat, Where Have You Been?", which specifically references visiting the Queen, were still widely known and helped maintain the innocent connotation. However, by the time the ITV series Victoria premiered in the 2010s, several decades later, the producers made a deliberate decision to completely omit this historically accurate nickname from their portrayal of the same character and the same royal family. The cultural meaning and associations of the word had shifted so dramatically in the intervening 40 years that what had been considered perfectly acceptable for broadcast in the 1970s was now seen as potentially inappropriate or distracting for modern audiences, even in a historical context where the usage would have been completely innocent and accurate to the actual time period being depicted. Fact 14. The series beat all competition to become Britain's #1 show. Edward VII faced what could have been a disastrous launch situation when it premiered on Tuesday, the 1st of April, 1975, which happened to fall during Easter week, when many British families were away on holiday or otherwise occupied with seasonal activities. The Tuesday night 9 o'clock time slot was also considered somewhat awkward for a prestige drama series, as it didn't benefit from the traditional weekend viewing patterns when audiences were more likely to settle in for longer programs. Most television executives would have predicted that these circumstances would make it difficult for the series to find its audience quickly, and there were legitimate concerns about whether viewers would even discover the show given the challenging premiere date and scheduling. However, despite these less than ideal conditions, Edward VII managed to overcome every obstacle and quickly captured the attention of British television audiences. By May of 1975, just 1 month after its premiere, the series had climbed to become the most-watched television program in all of Britain, beating out all competing shows on both the BBC and other ITV channels. This rapid rise to the top of the ratings demonstrated that the combination of high production values, excellent performances, and compelling historical storytelling had struck a chord with viewers who were willing to rearrange their schedules to watch the series each week. The success of the show was accompanied by significant promotional support, including the release of a special 68-page TV Times magazine that was produced specifically to accompany the series. This wasn't just a standard television listing supplement, but rather a substantial publication that cost 40 pence and featured lavish illustrations along with detailed articles about both the historical figures being portrayed and the making of the television series itself. The magazine served as both a companion guide for viewers and a collector's item that reflected the cultural significance the series had achieved within just a few weeks of its debut. Fact 15. Only 3 episodes actually show Edward as king. Despite the series being named Edward VII and ostensibly focused on his life and reign, the actual structure of the 13 episodes reveals something quite ironic about how the story was told. The first 10 episodes of the series are entirely devoted to Edward's extraordinarily long period as Prince of Wales, covering the nearly 60 years he spent waiting for his mother, Queen Victoria, to die so that he could finally inherit the throne and become king. This means that more than 3/4 of the entire series focuses on Edward's life before he had any real power or authority, showing his struggles with his mother's refusal to give him meaningful responsibilities, his various romantic relationships and scandals, and his growing frustration with being perpetually kept on the sidelines of British political life. Only the final 3 episodes, which were titled King at Last, The Peacemaker, and Good Old Teddy, actually depicted Edward's time as the reigning monarch of the United Kingdom. This allocation of screen time accurately reflected the historical reality that Edward's reign was remarkably short, lasting only 9 years from 1901, when Victoria finally died at age 81, until Edward's own death in 1910 at age 68. He had become king at the unusually advanced age of 59, making him one of the oldest people to ever accede to the British throne. And his relatively brief reign stood in stark contrast to the incredibly long wait that had preceded it. The structural choice to devote so much of the series to the waiting period rather than the actual kingship was entirely deliberate and served to emphasize what was perhaps the most defining characteristic of Edward's life. The series became less about the accomplishments of a king and more about the psychological and personal toll of spending 6 decades in preparation for a role that would ultimately last less than a tenth of that time, making it fundamentally a story about patience, frustration, and delayed destiny.